Fantasy Animation is a completely free online educational resource that provides weekly blogs and bi-weekly podcasts dedicated to the discussion of fantasy cinema and the medium of animation. It's staffed by academics and animators, all of whom work together to try to give you the most up-to-date and authoritative analysis of the relationship between fantasy cinema and the medium of animation. You can support our endeavours by accessing our online archive of blogs and podcasts and leaving a quick review for this podcast in whatever platform that's appropriate. Also pass it along to your friends. They'd love to hear it, I promise. This episode was recorded back in February, was in a special exclusive edition for the Anifest coordination we did, where we ran a day of blogs and podcasts for the Canterbury Anifest Festival. We're interviewing the festival director there, as well as academic in his own right, Chris Pallant, where he talks about his work with Smallfilms, in particular the acclaimed TV series Bagpuss. So you'll hear references to the Anifest crowd. As you said, this was an exclusive for them, but now we're delighted to share it with the rest of you, and we hope you enjoy the show.
Once upon a time, not so long ago.
Welcome everyone and the special Anifest crowd to this exclusive whimsical episode of the Fantasy Animation Podcast with me, a saggy old cloth cat, Chris Holliday.
I guess that makes me a wooden woodpecker, which I'm not necessarily happy with, but I'm Alex Sargent.
Sure. So this week we're returning to the work of the celebrated Kent-based Smallfilms studio, linking back to our episode a couple of years ago now on Pogle's Wood, with this one, which tackles Bagpuss, Peter Firmin and Oliver Postgate's 13-episode stop-motion series from the 1970s. Now, for me, of course, there's lots to say about craft, about the handmade, but also, I think, imagination and storytelling. Alex, is this tale of a stop-motion moggy whose seemingly erratic sleep patterns have the ability to turn inanimate objects into walking, talking characters at all fantastical?
I like this new thing you're doing. Yeah, I mean, obviously, and I think very folky. I've got a lot to say about songs and communities and passing stories between one another and the joy of storytelling as a collective rather than as a singular. Because I think, oddly, Bagpuss is completely about that. So yeah, I'm excited.
Yes, and joining us for this special episode is Dr. Chris Pallant, who is a reader in film studies at Canterbury Christchurch University, a festival director, of course, of the Canterbury Anifest, and also president of the Society for Animation Studies. Now, Chris is the author of a number of books, articles, and chapters across film and media studies. So this includes his monograph, Demystifying Disney, and also the edited collection Storyboarding, A Critical History from 2015, and then also Animated Landscapes, History, Form and Function the same year. His most recent anthology is on the history, production and cultural legacy of Disney's Snow White with, and I've just put here, a wonderful co-editor. Just put that there. Who can that be? He's also published further work on Disney, the cartoonism of Quentin Tarantino's live-action films, performance, capture technology and video games. But we've got him on specially today because of his new project related to Smallfilms. More of that later. So, Chris, really big thanks to you for joining us today on this special episode.
Thanks for having us, guys. It's a real pleasure to be here. Welcome to the Anifest crowd as well. It's great to be able to do something this year and reach out to the Anifest crowd and to tackle a subject that's really close to home. So, thank you for that really generous introduction. And yeah, I'm really excited to get cracking about Bagpuss today. It's interesting as well to hear the introduction you just made. You touched on the word whimsical. Alex touched on the word community. It's almost as if you've got a direct webcam somewhere watching me, write the book that I'm working on at the moment. You're picking up key words. Well done.
Well, you said actually close to home, and I think, given what I know about you and actually where I'm and you are recording this podcast, I think close to home takes on perhaps a slightly different edge. But we wanted to get you on, as I said, in relation to your current research into Smallfilms. So before we get into Bagpuss, and we've sort of asked you to give us a cross-section of episodes, and we'll go through and rank them and talk about what Bagpuss is doing and perhaps its relationship to the studio more broadly, we were hoping and wondering if you could kind of plot a little bit of your journey into the studio. How did you arrive at looking at this small but influential animation studio?
Yeah, absolutely. I guess the story starts when I was a child watching Clangers reruns when I was a little kid, sitting down with my mum. Clangers was always kind of probably my favourite growing up. But in recent years, I think I've moved over to Bagpuss as the kind of the primary text when it comes to small films. So that's the kind of the old version of the story. But then 2014-15, made some connections with Peter Firmin and Dan Postgate, brought them down to speak to Anifest that year. And really got on well with them, and just had this eureka moment that I don't need to actually travel to Los Angeles to do research about screen media. I can actually do it and stay at home. And with a small family growing up around me, that really appealed. And then the more I dug into it, the more I realised that actually there was still plenty of stories to tell, because the version we all know of small films' history is very much the Postgatean version of that. It comes from his autobiography, Seeing Things. He was an artful storyteller and was in control of that story. And Peter Firmin, very unassuming, didn't really kind of want to put himself in the spotlight. So it just kind of naturally over time, you get this quite one-dimensional account of the history, which is for the most part is pretty solid and lines up with the kind of factual record, but there are gaps because of that. And the more I dug into it, the more I realised that there was work to be done. So I applied for a Leverhulme, got a Leverhulme back in end of 2017. So this is the third year of the project. I should be finishing this year, but they very graciously gave me an extra year and a half because I took shared parental leave, and also COVID-19 has happened, so that's really slowed things down. But we're nearly there. I was just saying to Alex that I've got about 90,000 words of the book written, and if there wasn't currently a pandemic and I wasn't homeschooling, then the book would be finishing itself this month, next month. But it'll be ready for summer, and it'll be out soon. It's called Beyond Bagpuss. It's coming out with the BFI. So I look forward to that soon.
Well, I was just going to ask, sort of, as someone coming to small films as a relative outsider, I know of a lot of these shows, but I don't think I've seen many of them. What is the standard narrative of small films? How are they sort of seen or consumed, sort of on a popular level? And then what is your project trying to kind of add to or complicate with that narrative?
Yeah, I think primarily they're seen as kind of quintessentially British. There's that kind of angle, which I am interested in to a certain degree in the book, but also it's not really my bag to kind of unravel that. It just feels like such a knotty issue to get into, and I see so much stuff within the work of small films, across all the projects. There's actually more universal than that. There's also the sense that you kind of got the genius artists as well. Postgate is certainly held up in high esteem, quite rightly, and Firmin is also kind of attached to that, but not quite as associated. I did an interesting study of the press coverage of small films in the wake of both of their deaths in terms of the obituaries, and the word frequency for Postgate's surname compared to Firmin's, you kind of double the word count for Postgate compared to Firmin. So that was telling me something, although it's quite blunt. So yeah, I think craft, as Chris mentioned, absolutely. Faulkner as well. The sense that it's connected to the pastoral on many occasions within the works. As you've already covered in the Pogles episode you did, tapping into kind of the folkloric. So yeah, there's plenty of threads that weave through. For me, one of the big things is the kind of collaborative nature of the works, the community element which you see on screen, but is also there, within the production context, and that's really that's the big driver for me in terms of the book that I've been writing, is to excavate that story and to kind of put it on the page and fill in the gaps where many of the collaborators that we perhaps know about in passing, we don't really appreciate how deeply involved they were in the production.
Well, actually, on the note of production, I know that you're interested in archiving and thinking about the pre-production materials, as indicated by your stuff on storyboarding. And so I wondered, actually, given that you work and I live quite close to where the studio was, where's your first port of call in that sense? Where is the material being held? You said you didn't need to go to Los Angeles, but is there material with which you can work with? Because I don't really know much about either your journey into it, but also where you're conducting this research. Where is the stuff, and is there much stuff? Have you found stuff to work with as part of this project?
Well, whoever's listening to this, I might have to hunt you down and silence you if I tell you the actual locations of these secret documents. I will say that quite close to me right now is the entire Postgate archive. Literally
Right.
quite close to me.
Yep.
Which is so that's been very helpful, during the pandemic era. The local to Canterbury, I'm not going to go into the details because these places are quite easy to find. But certainly local to Canterbury, there is another sizable private family archive that I've been able to work from. But beyond that, it's been going to the BBC over Reading Way, the written archives there, which has got a huge amount of small films related material. And that's been, spent probably 6 full days in total over there, doing over the course of a couple of years. And I need to get back there when they reopen. And bumped into Van Norris as well while I was over there. And it was just kind of fluke that he was there doing some research as well on British television satirical comedies, I think, from the 70s. So that was nice. But yeah, archives spread around BFI, BBC, and the privately held family archives. That's been the bread and butter of it. And there's lots of material within those.
Well, it's good to give a shout out to my colleague Van Norris. So that's always that's my job with my University of Portsmouth hat on. Okay, so let's talk about Bagpuss then, because if I haven't seen many of these shows, I'm aware of the clangers, but I think Bagpuss has somehow, whether on purpose or by accident, become the kind of talismanic, iconic character of the Postgate brand. If you were doing a sort of if we're doing a small films land, I think Bagpuss would be, greeting guests at the front gate in that kind of horror. I've just imagined a nightmare scenario where that actually happens, so please don't do that.
It's a lovely vision. I can see the mouth, this gaping mouth, and walk into Bagpuss. Beautiful.
So tell us why Bagpuss? Why did you want to do Bagpuss? What is it about the show? And is there anything about sort of how the show has been sort of nostalgically or romantically received that sort of has allowed this particular one to establish itself as almost a sort of example of all the other small films works?
Yeah, good question. I guess get the ref klaxon ready for the mix afterwards. In terms of the book's title, Beyond Bagpuss, in terms of everything you kind of commented about, that's what I was continually confronted with, this sense that people know about Bagpuss. I did the audience survey. I've got almost 1,200 responses to the audience survey that I put out, and Bagpuss is the show that most people know about. It's their most popular show. Bagpuss has topped countless popular television surveys as kind of the most popular animated character. In terms of episodes as well, it's kind of up there when they do episodic rankings of animation. So there's clearly something there. When I went over to Reading to do a day in the archive, I was driving home, went onto the motorway, I was stuck in the traffic crawling along the M25, look out of the window next to me, there's a car with a Bagpuss nodding head thing on the dashboard, and it just was one of those moments where I thought, I am onto something here. This is a path to follow. So why has it been so durable? It was repeated for about 13 years in reruns across BBC and Channel 4. So there was a real sense that it was kind of prevalent in your eyes when you were a kid growing up for a number of generations. I think in terms of the kind of the elements that it brings together, we look across all the different Small Things shows. It is towards the high point going into the end of their kind of production story. So they were skilled. They knew what they were doing. They were confident. The BBC were very much leaning into them to kind of produce work. So there's that sense of just going for it and not really holding back with Bagpuss. I think what you said at the start, Alex, as well, which was maybe we pre-record, was to do with the kind of segmented, kind of almost modular nature of Bagpuss. Again, that sense that you sit down, you watch an episode, and you get a bit of everything. You get a bit of stop motion, a bit of hand drawn, you get some songs. It's funny, it's absolutely loaded. It's kind of layered, as I talk about in the book, in terms of what it brings to the table. The word actually used in the chapter is bricolage, but I don't want to get into that too much. I think we can just stick with layered for now.
Mm-hmm. Because I was interested in the ways in which, because I also wasn't too familiar with the program, and I'd heard of a couple of the other ones. So was this, I mean, it seems like the studio, Small Films, this kind of quite cottage industry based out of this old space, dealt with a lot of different types of animation, and so actually I was wondering whether or not Bagpuss is sort of does it contain the sort of signature Small Films elements that we would come to know of, or actually does it I don't know, try and develop. You said it comes at a high point, but looking through the show, I was struck by the different uses of animation and the different, the framing story is often, well, it has kind of real photographs, but it's stop motion. Then you have other different forms of animation, and I hadn't really realised that, and it seems a lot more nuanced than I perhaps gave it credit for. But is something like, because this is Bagpuss comes after the Clangers, and so they were, and Pogle's Wood, but before that were they still in stop motion, or is this something that they came to relatively late on in their life cycle?
No, this kind of returns to the point I was making about confidence, that they'd had a fair bit of time to get used to working with stop motion. So you've got Pogle's Wood. I mean, they transition with Penguins. Penguins is the first one where they go to stop motion. Then they move into Pogle's Wood. Then you've got Clangers, and then you've got the Forgotten show that they worked on. Put you on the spot. What's the Forgotten show that comes in between Clangers and Bagpuss? The absolute high point of Smallfilms fame, notoriety, and confidence and production.
I'm so glad I'm the fantasy person on this show.
It's not on Wikipedia. You won't find it on Wikipedia. It's okay. This is good. This is showing that the underpinning research that kind of informs this talk is valuable. They worked on Sam on Boss Island. So that's not strictly speaking, not a Smallfilms production. It's a BBC educational show, but they did all of the stop motion work for that show. And I've done a screen time count, a data kind of survey across all the shows, and Sam on Boss Island has more animated screen time than several other Smallfilm shows, so it kind of deserves recognition. So yeah, they'd absolutely had a lot of time to kind of practice themselves with stop motion before they got to Bagpuss. And I think one of the things that I love about it is that the kind of the yaffle. When you look at that yaffle, what do you see? They're wearing their heart on their sleeve. You see the Meccano, on screen, which up until that point had been inside, the armatures of Clangers and Penguins and stuff like that.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned about the sort of the official and the unofficial, what gets included and folded into the history and what left. And I feel like this happens with a lot of animation studios, actually, whether it's Ghibli or whether it's Pixar, or it's the sort of the things that you count as part of the narrative or the industrial narrative, and then also the films or the shorts that weren't quite the bit before the studio started properly. So that's it. I hadn't noticed that, and you're right, it doesn't. I did a little check, and it does not appear on Wikipedia. It gives you a nice little timeline of the different things, and there's a sort of greatest hits. Surely that to go from Pogle's Wood to the Clangers to Bagpuss is, I mean, only bettered surely by the Fast and the Furious franchise in terms of just increasing value. I wanted to get that in because I just thought their track record of certain kinds of things is, and I wasn't too familiar with lots of them, but seen odd episodes of either the Engine, Nog and the Nog, but I got my teeth into Bagpuss, which I guess is something we should
so what we've asked you to do,
now,
Chris, is to provide us with 5 episodes that you think sort of encapsulates the show, and you're going to rank them for us live. So we don't know what your rankings are, but we're excited to find out. So why don't you kick things off by telling us the sort of the least favourite, we'll phrase it like that, of the 5. What's the starter one, and give us a quick sort of plot synopsis and tell us why you've picked that one.
Yeah, I think I've been a little bit. I've used the ranking as well to help us in terms of have a conversation about Bagpuss 2. So I've gone for Ship in a Bottle as number 5. Now I would probably put that a little bit higher, but I think it's really helpful for us to talk about it first.
Such a pro.
Yeah, well, got to tell a story. It's all about storytelling. So you've probably seen the episode. Many people listening have probably seen the episode. It's quite a famous one. The first episode of the series. The kind of framing devices of Bagpuss. They're in the shop. They come awake, and something's been brought. Emily's brought something. She's found something that's broken, and over the course of the episode, they need to figure out what this thing is. And usually there's a few wrong turns, and they use different types of methods to figure it out, either through song, or they'll actually say to Bagpuss, right, use your magical thoughts and take us to a place. And eventually they figure out that it's a broken ship in a bottle. And then you have an episode which kind of shows how they then try to reconstruct this ship in a bottle. And there's this lovely kind of child mouse endangerment as they try to shove the mouse head first into the bottle to get him, and Madeline's on the top of the shelf. Oh, stop, I don't think you should do that. And my heart's in my mouth every time I see poor Charlie Mouse being shoved in. and eventually they raise the sails, and it's fixed. And I think it's a lovely episode because it pulls together so many of those threads. I think it's a nice one for us to start with in terms of. I mean, for fantasy as well. I mean, that's why I put it first. I thought it's a nice one to think of the different layers of fantastical storytelling.
It seems like every it does. Every episode has, as you say, this sort of framing set of devices. Once upon a time, not so long ago, these sort of sepia photographs evoking childhood memories, and then we have a brief introduction as to all of the characters. And I think that's the first sort of between 2 minutes 45, 3 minutes are always the same of every episode, introducing the different kinds of characters in a sort of it's the narrative that Toy Story wishes it was in terms of the inanimate object sort of thing. And there's a long history in animation of the toy shop coming to life and so forth. And it seems like the program, every episode shifts to colour when Bagpuss wakes up. That cues the moment of communal activity, and so actually you can do a nice little, this episode deals with this rag, and this episode deals with, and so I really liked the standardness of it, on the seriality of it. But I think you're right in terms of it's the first episode of the program, and I have a few things about character movement and sea shanties, which are obviously very in vogue at the moment. Sea shanties.
I've intentionally deleted TikTok from my phone, and I take great pleasure in seeing the world going crazy about sea shanties and knowing it's TikTok, but not knowing at all what's going on. It's very good.
Yep. So I wrote down sea shanties about mice and ducks sailing a ship, but anyway, we'll come on to that. And obviously lots of stuff about storytelling. I think for me, knowing of the very small stuff that's written on small films, and we're talking paragraphs in broader sort of histories of animation or interrogations of particular kinds of animated aesthetics. It seems like this episode fits perfectly in terms of, it stands in for small films in terms of their relationship to industrialization and mass production, and a broader ethos of trying to reuse rather than buy stuff in. We're not going to throw this away, we'll put it back together. And so I really liked that. It did seem, I'm assuming that this is not necessarily an obvious reading, but a sort of, this is really what the program's about. In this episode, it's really setting up exactly the relationship that the characters have to each other, but also the relationship that the characters have to the things that are brought in, which are going to be repurposed and reused and sort of given back to the world.
And so much of that is different fantasies of different objects, right? The narrative of let's put the ship in the bottle is a nice microcosm for the imaginative interest in different objects doing different things, because we've got this kind of triad mythology, right, of that's set up kind of each week, which is that Emily brings Bagpuss to life. So there's a certain, the fantasy of animating a cat, and then now's the time for my obligatory Wizard of Oz reference of the week, in that we get that sort of change from the still black and white photograph to the colour as motion comes in, and then we've got Bagpuss as an enabler of other images, right? Bagpuss breathes life into the sort of, or brings to life the hand drawn. Well, they're not, they're animations in some episodes, and in other episodes they're more sort of stills. But so we've got a sort of dual layer going on. So I was fascinated by the sort of the way the film plays with the imaginative spaces of different objects, because we've got one fantastical object that shouldn't be moving, bringing to life other objects that shouldn't be visualized, all woven together within this sort of collective narrative of, there's a ship in the bottle, but also we'll pause and have a sing-song with the frog, and all this kind of stuff. So this kind of messy, chaotic joy in different objects. And I'm very interested in Bagpuss as a character. I think like Freud did with Hamlet, I'm going to attempt to sort of unpack the role of Bagpuss as both an object of fantasy and an enabler of fantasy, in that he is both the sort of locus of our fantastical imagination, and he brings to life the fantastical creature whilst basically being a bit sleepy. So loads of interesting things about objectness in the show.
And fear and anxiety and threat are kind of key for Freud in terms of the deep kind of seats of psychology, and that's what we kind of glaze over at the very end of the episode. There's this sense of threat. It's never really explored in any of the episodes, but there is this concern that, Bagpuss is going to sleep now. We
Yeah.
need to kind of get back in position. Madeline voices it a couple of times, and there's just this suggestion of something bad could happen, which is something that Peter Firmin certainly explores in Pinny's House. If you for listeners want to explore another episode, another show, there is a fragment of that still on YouTube that you can find. You can't find the whole series, but he kind of goes more heavily into that sense of something bad could have happened if these toys weren't kind of allowed to rest in the right place. I think you're right. There's Bagpuss is absolutely the kind of the agency, the point of agency within this, and lots of things channel through him. And Alex, you're spot on. That the mermaid sequence is not animated; it's still paintings, still watercolor paintings that have been done by an artist called Linda Birch. She did 11 of those, and you kind of zooming in, pan and scan, moving around to kind of give the sense of kinetic energy. But the animation is restricted to the cutout cardboard animation that Peter Firmin created, which is the mouse moving and the stop motion.
I'm glad you mentioned I'm glad you took my Freudian thread and went with it, Chris, there, because I think I've written down melancholy, and there's absolutely, I mean, there's lots of theorists sort of like from Chris Stever is the sort of uber text on melancholy about sort of the fantasy storytelling is in many ways a melancholic act, in that it's what is it but stories about things we really want to exist but we know don't exist, and that sense of mournfulness for a world that could be but we know never will be. That ending is really peculiar, but in a beautiful way, because there's this real emphasis on, I guess on death, on stillness as death, and that I guess links to sort of Mulvey's stuff on sort of stillness and the death that lies behind any frame, whether it be live action or animation. The frame by frame animation is in many ways an attempt to get over the stillness of what's actually there, which is the inanimate image. Absolutely. Like, there's this. What does the voiceover says? It says something like, and then Bagpuss becomes a cloth cat, and the mice will become but objects, and there's this real emphasis that that was fun, but let's get back to reality now, and reality isn't.
Well, it was the past.
Yeah,
it was the past as well. I mean, Bagpuss was made in the mid 70s. Yet we're shown a world. It never really dates it accurately, but the implication of the sepia images and the dress of Emily and the types of toys, that we're looking at a world that was probably 70, 80 years earlier. So, what's the implication there as well? That we're possibly looking into a world of a very old individual, or maybe has even passed away. So they're not really fully explored, but you can get a sense of it as an adult viewer. There's kind of that dual address going on. There's a world for the child viewer to watch, and then there's also, if you're there with the child watching it, more for you to kind of get your teeth stuck into too, which is the Pixar move. That's why we're all sitting there crying.
It just struck me as I was kind of thinking about the dates of this, that Bagpuss is 3 years before Star Wars. just as a strange moment there. I like what the program especially in this first episode does, and actually this is something that is traceable across all of the episodes that I watched. This sort of kind of value and hierarchies of cultural value, and the way that the program and does so through the characters, and also does so through Emily. Is sort of reclaiming the trivial, so setting up a series of substantial relationships and meaningfulness to these sorts of trivial kind of objects. I actually had a question when I was watching, because I didn't actually know too much about the intricacies of the narrative, and I wrote down a question at the very start of the episode: is the cat found or is the cat real? And I was trying to figure out if the cat was real, Bagpuss was real, and just animated, but was a real cat, and it was her pet, and Bagpuss liked to sleep in the window, and that was like a thing. And then it took me a while to I see it's a toy that also comes to life, and actually I was trying to think about why that distinction was important, and then I thought, well, it's actually about the child's, and I was thinking about her the idea of narration and the fact that it privileges her activities, and really she is the catalyst for everything that happens in the episode, because she brings this object, or this old piece of rag, or this ship that's in a bottle but in pieces, or wooden boxes that are able to create chocolate biscuits from butter beans and breadcrumbs. So she brings all this stuff into and I was thinking about her role as sort of narrator and what that means for the idea of imagination, and that level of narration, or that level of imaginative processes where we are watching an animated character come to life who has an agency, and who has an agency that his memories and imagination can fix in lots of ways objects in the real world. And there are lots of lines in this first episode. What we need is a magic story. And something I can relate to, I need my thinking cap, which is something we all need at the moment. And his thoughts appeared like magic. So there's a lot going on in this first episode, and over the course of 12 minutes or so, has to really and specifically identify the things that can and can't happen, and the levels of imagination that those activities relate to. So, yeah. Good choice for episode 1 and episode 1.
So I guess let's keep this conversation going on into the next episodes. Are we going to keep going chronologically, or where are we going next, Chris?
No, we're going to jump ahead.
Okay.
So the next episode, number 4 on the ranking, is Flying.
Okay.
Which I think is episode 12. I think it's the back end of the penultimate episode. So this is another one that kind of. I like this, that you might be able to figure out the reason why I've picked this one. If I say Yaffle is kind of, he takes us on a journey from episode 1 to episode 12. There's a kind of an interesting character development that we see. But also this is a story about a basket that's found, and they try to work out what this basket is. And eventually we discover that it's a flying basket. So the episode's all about how the characters might be able to get this basket to fly again. And we go off on a couple of different flights of fancy, excuse the pun, through different types of animated media to look at different ways that the characters might conceive of flying. And again, it's the kind of whimsicalness. I use whimsy a lot in the book. I talk about whimsy, and I think it comes back to something that Alex was saying, because for me, whimsy feels like it has the balance between light and dark within whimsy as well. There's the sense that you can go to a dark place, but then come back to something that's more upbeat. It also feels a kind of quixotic, that you never may be able to predict what's going to come next. There's kind of twists and turns within whimsy. And this episode feels like it's absolutely packed full of whimsical moments where you feel like you head in a direction, and then suddenly, the church mouse is telling you the accurate distance to the sun. It's 93 million miles away to the sun. That's why you can't get to it, which you don't anticipate to appear. And I also love the kind of Heath Robinson-esque book that they have, Percy Pratt's Aeronautics, which Heath Robinson is the popular point of reference to go to, but I would also say it's Postgatean. Oliver Postgate's got this real track record of these crazy inventions. Read his autobiography. He makes a homemade washing machine for his mum that just sounds lethal, and he invents kind of renewable energies and all sorts of stuff. That he's kind of new types of spectacles. He's always thinking about invention. So I think whenever you see characters like that, whether it's in Noggin the Nog, or whether it's in Sam and Buff's Island, you've got these kind of inventor figures. I feel like Postgate's trying to put a bit of himself on screen as well. So that's my choice for number 4.
So on that issue of invention, and perhaps this ties back into the sort of tabletop aesthetic and the labour that occurs within not a domestic space, but something that happens quite close to home, to use your phrase from earlier on. And I was thinking about then the role of Professor Yaffle, which seems to be based, according to the internet, on Bertrand Russell, which may or may not be true. You're smiling at me in a way that, like, yes, people always say that, or of course this is obvious. But anyway, you're the one that's doing the project.
First answer. I've written about that as well. That's like the standard anecdote. It's everywhere.
Yeah.
Can't escape.
Yeah.
But why is that?
Well,
that's an interesting thing that's kind of gained traction.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad that I hit the inadvertent nail on the head. But my question was then going to be about his role within this episode, which is about belief. And this happens, actually, there's the episode, so episode 8, the mouse mill, that does something similar with his incredulity that actually it's all a trick. He talks about a trick and it being a rotten trick. It's a deception and illusion. And his role in this episode is to challenge the idea that a basket, or talk about basket and cabbage leaves, can fly, to then fly off to scrape gold off of the sun with a spoon. And then he says, if you want to know about a particular subject, you must study it in detail. One for the students. But there's also something around his role in relation to belief, and whether or not this is something, I haven't seen enough of them to know what his narrative role is in this world of toys that come to life. And he comes into being as this woodpecker, but then goes back and becomes a bookend, so has a different kind of functional value. but then it's proved to be a falsehood because he sees this basket flying away and he can't believe that this is happening because that's not what his brain has told him that flight should encompass, and then it's revealed to be an illusion. And so I was just wondering about what your thoughts were, Chris, on his role in the series, I guess, across these 13 episodes. And is he your favourite character?
I feel sorry for him. That's for sure.
He's the intellectual of the group, right? In a bad way and a good, yeah.
I empathise with Yaffle, particularly having young kids who probably see me in that regard as well. No, I think that you dig into Postgate, you dig into Postgate's views on what we're doing right now. You know, he would be turning in his grave the fact that we're doing this, that we're kind of subjecting his work to kind of intellectual study and we're reading things into it. You know, his view is always very much a kind of, it is what it is. You know, I was telling stories and I was just kind of using the devices to hand. You know, I interviewed Peter Firmin many times before he passed away, and he was so resistant to kind of wanting to entertain the idea of there being a subtext or a meaning or anything like that. You know, it's always kind of surface level, very literal. But I don't fully buy into that because you know, Oliver Postgate was a smart guy, and he was aware of the world going on around him. And I think, you know, with the Yaffle character, they wanted somebody that could be this kind of figure of kind of the intellectual, which he values. When he's talking about, you know, you need to consult a book and you're going to need to do your homework and your research, that's something that Oliver Postgate and Peter Firmin would absolutely, you know, advocate for. But they're both also very practical and kind of applied thinkers and kind of want to do things and put things into practice. They're proponents of craft, and I think that's what he's trying to kind of introduce, that balance. You know, don't become too focused and narrow in your vision of, you know, how to, you know, kind of think or think about things or achieve things. Try and do and fail, and that's what kind of the mice do. And yes, it's deception and it's a kind of a funny little moment, but I think that's what he's trying to get at with that.
And it's significant, surely, that he's made of wood. That this character, that's the only character that can't be moulded and bent and squashed or made more malleable, is this chiseled, varnished, inert thing, and his position is inert, and you know what it does is it's a classic fantasy rhetoric that get a character on screen voicing all the potential rational concerns you might have about it and paint him as a bit of a wally, and the audience goes with the other side because emotionally it feels better to go with the characters that seem to be having fun than the character that seems to be sitting there crossing his wings, kind of moaning at everything. So absolutely, you know, it's they know what they're doing. It's a way of getting the audience on side of the irrational as opposed to the scientific or the empiric. So I just thought, you know, there's got that, you know, it's not an accident that character is made of wood at the same time.
But I was thinking about his role as a bookend and how that's, you know, he's linked to reading and broadening the mind and all this sort of stuff. And so I like his role in relation to belief. But actually, your point about his materiality relates to a note I made about the first episode, actually, about the role of character movement and how actually the character the movement has to do the job of the voice in lots of cases as part of the performance, because it's not that this is not sophisticated animation. It absolutely is. I just mean a lot of the characters, their mouths don't speak in the way, or the movement of the mouth isn't necessarily anchored to what they're saying, and that makes sense given that a lot of them are toys. We have toys and dolls and so forth, and so actually I think what stop motion does perhaps as a medium, and this brings to the fore quite substantially, is that that the character movement has to do a lot. And I know that you know, Chris, you've written on performance capture and things like this, but character movement has to do the job of other performance elements, actually more so in something like Bagpuss, because of I think the role of what the voice plays in performance in something like this, which isn't, you know, this is him doing all of the majority of the voices, I believe, but there was just something around, I was watching it being really struck by how the characters are moving, and that ends up communicating a lot of the performance of the character. So it's not just adhering to their materiality as wood or as felt or as whatever it is that they're actually built of, but actually at the level of character, the movement is having to substitute in a lot of expressive movement in their face which they don't have, or the voice which their mouths don't often move. Or so I was just struck on the importance that Bagpuss has to character movement, which is sort of what the program's about the threat of what happens when you can't move after 10 minutes because old Bagpuss is falling asleep again. So I really liked the emphasis on movement and really enjoyed, which is obviously stop motion. There's lots of stuff around the jerkiness of stop motion and the labour and the manifestation of labour, and it's sort of a three-dimensional articulation of the idea of boiling in cell animation. So there's lots and lots of stuff around stop motion's relationship to movement, and within the context of child's play, playing with objects, the way that we make characters move. But I thought this was a really striking example of the absolute fundamental importance of movement to the articulation of character as a substitute for other performance elements.
Yeah. I guess when Yaffle looks up when the basket begins to fly, and he's kind of saying, he kind of runs out of words because he's in disbelief, and the pose is held with his beak open for about 4 or 5 seconds. He's kind of in that pose, and on the one hand, that would be a kind of Postgate thinking about what's the most economical way to do the animation. He talks a lot about only really using extremes. That's all you need. You need the extreme body positions to convey the meaning. You don't need the stuff in between as much. So he's kind of found the right pose for Yaffle. That kind of physical pose that he's in conveys everything. The words have left him. His jaw's dropped. He's looking up in disbelief, and the kind of materiality of him helps to reinforce that point. And it's I kind of to put on the record though that this is. Peter Firmin again, the craftsmanship of Yaffle, is down to Peter Firmin being able to put his hand to a range of different materials and to deliver the goods.
I feel like I know not a lot about the character because he's the first one, if I remember, in every episode to go and inspect what's being brought in, and the episodes spend a lot of time actually showing his journey from the shelf to the floor. And I feel like that's a really conscious decision. Of course, he's the professor. Okay, he's based on Bertrand Russell. He goes and has a look because, of course, he's fundamentally inquisitive. But the walk that he does, and I'm saying he, but the walk that the bird does with the male voice as it walks down towards the floor tells me an awful lot, really economically, in terms of pose and movement and the sort of juddering about what that character is and why he's the first character to go down. And because, of course, he would be, because he's the professor. But anyway, I love him as a character. So I guess we should go to number 3 then.
Sure.
Or the third of your 5 episodes.
Yeah, number 3, we have got The Frog Princess, which is mid-series, I think, from memory.
My favourite's hanging on in there so far. I won't declare what it is,
yeah,
but it's
well,
hanging on in there.
Yeah. We could probably all predict what number 1's going to be. So yeah, this one is kind of these jewels, these unknown jewels arrive in the shop, and they've got to figure out what they are, and then the jewels are kind of put into various different configurations playfully throughout the episode until they realise that these were the jewels that belonged to a frog princess. And along the way, we kind of hear the story of this frog princess, kind of her many suitors, and then finally we get some kind of nice reversals in terms of fairy tale expectation and kind of almost kind of rejections of fairy tale expectations throughout the episode as well. So I really like it for a number of reasons. I mean, we're into the point now, kind of ranking 3, 2, and 1, where I'm actually giving you kind of qualitative reasons why I think these are up there. Visually, it's very experimental at times. The episode, it kind of makes connections with some experimental animation, kind of abstract animation. Norman McLaren, kind of springs to mind. The fact that again we've got some really beautiful watercolor in there as well, and I just love the narrative. I think the narrative of it is strong, and there's a real kind of conviction in terms of gender equality, which is kind of seeping through as well, which would have been a contemporary topic, and Postgate and Firmin would reject me and say, no, it's just a fairy tale. You're reading too much, but there's something there that's kind of percolating through the fabric.
And there's something about this is me forgetting characters' names, but the ragdoll character Madeline is almost always the storyteller. So when there's that segment of sharing this folk story, she is given the voiceover. She is given the story to tell. And Bagpuss kind of visualizes the story, right? So, or at least that's the sort of mythology of it. And of course, that links to lots of stuff on the folk storytelling is traditionally a sort of female, feminine oriented household task. It would be in a patriarchal society, it was the women that shared the folk stories, because men were actually being Yathol climbing down from his shelf, sharing official stories that were wooden and written and the written word, whilst these sort of more feminine spaces where these stories would be told over households, over work, and all this kind of stuff. Marina Warner writes much better than this than I'm articulating here. So it's interesting that the storyteller and the person that commands the crowd is this ragdoll character. And again, that's a nice little juxtaposition of object with function and all this kind of stuff.
You're halfway there, Alex. I want to just kind of add a little bit to that. The person that voices Madeline is Sandra Kerr, so famous folk singer, and the person that voices Gabriel the Toad is John Faulkner, and they're kind of this famous folk double act, very prolific, and they do the theme tune to Bagpuss, and they wrote lots of the songs, and they worked with Postgate and Firmin on a few other occasions, and I completely agree with you that Madeline does quite often provide that kind of impetus for the storytelling within the episode. But I see it as, over the course of all 13 episodes, there's a bit more of a kind of a duality, a tension almost between Gabriel and Madeline. They almost kind of compete with each other to be the kind of prima storyteller. But that is because they're coming from the voices of the folk singers, who are then going to provide the song and the story and the background.
And what that does with that dual, you're right, with the dual, and actually it's often the frog that sort of sings the song that kind of links vaguely to the story and all this kind of stuff. And the show is very quick to emphasise that as much as they are the storytellers, they are not the birthers of the story. This isn't Madeline, right? Everyone gather around and I'll create a story for you. It's sharing some unspoken heritage or culture that's happening beyond the story itself. I'll tell you a story that I was once told, and it's that communal aspect of the story that it is quick to emphasise. So yes, it's not all on the singular. There's a duality to it as well.
I have my notes for this episode are I have both a comment and a question in true academic conference style. My comment is, I actually thought this was in this episode, which is about storytelling and about the power of storytelling. It made me think, and there's a line of, it's just a watery fairy tale. It's just and it made me think that this program is actually in lots and lots of ways about the consequential nature of storytelling. The things that you can imagine can fix the world, and the stories can be explanatory. They explain, or they give a version of an event about, this is how this object was used, this is the history, this is the context. And so actually, more than just the idea of storytelling, I've got this idea of just a watery fairy tale, the story of the princess's crown, which I thought was cel animated, but I think from what you said it's more watercolour, at the very least drawings on paper, because the background seems to stay the same while the characters move, but it's not a fluid motion. It taps into what you were saying earlier about the held poses, or the kind of keyframes in lots of ways, I suppose. But a song about this song about a sad princess who lived in the depths of a cool mountain pool, that is then dismissed as just a watery fairy tale, it got me thinking about the power that this program sort of emphasizes with regards to storytelling. And there are so many. We have the narration, the photographs. We go into the shop. The tone changes. We get Bagpuss's version of events, his imagination, the song that tells the story, and all these different layers of storytelling I thought were fantastic, and the different consequences that each of those acts of imagination can have. That's my comment. My question is, maybe this is, I don't know, but to me it stood out because it's the Frog Princess, and I was like, oh, I know this story. I mean, I obviously don't because of the way it's been manipulated and played with. But I was just wondering, is this a common across the series? Do they often lean on culturally resonant stories, or do they? Because a lot of the stuff is original, but I just is the Frog Princess exceptional?
To an extent, they do lean on established stories, and they kind of go broader as well. There's some kind of Chinese folk tales as well. They bring in, and Irish mythology, and they draw on it. But this is the one that really properly goes into kind of an established fairy tale realm where we think we know it, and I think that's the reason why they do that. So then they can flip it. in terms of the watercolor that you're talking about, that's Charlotte Firmin did the watercolors. There's 11 of those again, and they pan and scan and move around. I've not really looked across the series to think about which is the one that takes you deepest into the area layers, but this one feels like it's probably the one that does it, because you've got Emily, well, you've got the photograph, you've got Emily, you've got Bagpuss, you've got Madeline, then you've got Gabriel, and then you start to kind of come back out. So it goes very deep. I think it's just, I think in what Alex was talking about as well, I picked this one specifically because of the community aspect. You know, it's a story that has to be told together. It's not a story that any one of them individually can tell.
Yeah, I have a little, little Charlotte Firmin story. When I was at school, at primary school, she came into the school with a big piece of paper and a pen, and she encouraged us to come up with the story on the spot, and she illustrated the story live for us, which was fantastic. And somewhere that drawing will exist in our old primary school. But so and the Firmin name is, and the Postgate names are certainly they are our local celebs, I would say. But also they haven't read the Snow White book yet, so let's not call judgment on that too much. I suppose the only other note I had about this episode was, you said at the start of the description that the bits of the kind of fragments, the bits of metal that are described as painted or enamelled, are placed in different configurations, and you have that really amazing little standout sequence right at the start that kind of looks like the inverse of silhouette animation, all these flat pieces of metal that are arranged to form a bird and a cat. And I really liked that flattened style, and that seemed indicative of a program that does an awful lot in terms. It's not just a stop motion series. There's a lot going on in terms of different forms of graphic illustration, as you said, Charlotte Firmin's work, but also just in a sort of experimental element. And you mentioned experimental animation before. They seem to be doing a lot more than just object animation, but really playing with different forms of expression, which I loved.
Well, that example, I mean, those enamelled pieces were created by Joan Firmin. Now, the brief for that, from what I can gather, was pretty slim. You know, essentially make me some enamel pieces, and she's created those kind of magnificent objects. Then, if you dig into the archive, you look at the storyboard, this is the famous McLaren. I mean, for me, it looks a bit like Le Merle, kind of McLaren-esque, the way it kind of metamorphosizes into different shapes, so the kind of cat chasing the bird. What happens between the frame is more important than what happens on the frame. Now, that kind of old McLaren statement, because this particular sequence, if you look at the script, it just says animated bird sequence. All it says. It's like Busby Berkeley musicals back in the day. You look at the script for those, it just says "See Buzz." That's all it says, and then there's going to be a 3-minute choreographed sequence that he'll introduce. So this is a sequence where you've got production back and forth between Sandra, Kerr, John Faulkner there producing the music. Postgate's then responding to the music, and he's animating in kind of straight ahead, quite experimental way, responding to the beats. So it's quite out of step with the rest of the series in that regard. So it's another one of those moments where Bagpuss just kind of says, you know what, let's do something different and experiment.
Yeah. Just a different way of thinking about these same of. I was wary actually in lots of ways about doing an episode like doing a program like this, just simply because I was thinking, we'll end up talking about the handmade and craft again as sort of the default, sort of the Aardman game that you play when you try and talk about Aardman without talking about things like handmade and the fingerprints, because there are fingerprints in the clay, like that's a thing. And actually, a sequence like that one that you expect, and I love the idea that the script was just super brief. It's a moment where they're doing something different. It's a different spin on the idea of the artisan or the idea of craft. Working together, you get scenes of communal activities. They build stuff, or they put stuff together, or they put the ship back in all these kinds of things. But that particular sequence, I thought, this is great. The first 3 minutes of an episode is always the same, and then I got this, and I was not expecting it. Gets a really stark black background as it plays with form and plays with animated movement again. So I think this program does an awful lot more than I thought in relation to ideas of these long-standing ideas of craft, presumably that are always going to be part of the small films industrial narrative.
And I guess just to add to that, I mean, I can't believe you guys get to have a conversation about fairy tales, and then I'm going to come in with something about mixed media. But the only thing I would say is, to add to all that, is that it's an interesting, again, this form and function coming together, in that what it articulates when you've got these sort of sequences like this is the shape dance, and then which are in a one form of animation, folded in with this other form of object animation that has a much more liminal quality with the real, in that it's both, you know, proto-filmic and not in many ways. That what it's doing is also highlighting the different imaginative uses of craft, in that there's a huge difference between, one's relationship to a picture versus one's relationship to a toy, and what you use in that respect. So the show folds that in very nicely. We should, though, move on to our runner-up prize, our silver medal. Yeah, absolutely. So Chris, why don't you take that?
That's
one?
appropriate if it's a silver medal, because we're going to go with the Owl of Athens. It's a lovely story. Again, it's one where we get the object, which is this dirty rag. What is this dirty rag? And it's revealed that actually it's some embroidered fabric, which has got this owl on. Then we're going to go through two very different animated sub-animated sequences, where we first of all go into kind of the story about the owls. Then we go into the song about the Bony King of Nowhere, which is my favourite song in all of Bagpuss. And that then kind of brings us back to the realisation that it's actually a cushion, and it's been beautifully finished. But all the way through that, we've got Joan Firmin's embroidery work, which is, you know, she's made the cushion. But if you look at the animation for the owl sequence, that's not pan and scanning over the cushion that we see at the end. That's multiple, I've not done the counting on this one, but there's multiple other sheets of embroidered material that Joan has produced to generate that sequence. So again, it's another one where you look in Postgate's autobiography and there's a sentence, 1.5 lines, you know, Joan Firmin did the embroidery. That's basically what he says. So this isn't a character assassination, this research project, but it's just a chance to kind of revisit some of these moments and ask the question, can we expand this a little bit more and give a little bit more detail to Joan Firmin and establish her contribution. And then in terms of the Bony King of Nowhere, that's an example where Sandra, Kerr and John Faulkner, you know, did some revisions on the song to introduce a bit more life. You know, the Postgate quite often wrote the songs in the original scripts. Some of them are stuck, whereas some of them went over to Kerr and Faulkner. They revised, completely removed and changed, and then they came back, and then they become the songs that we see in the series. So Bony King of Nowhere, with its playfulness, with its kind of implied rhymes, was something that they drove as well.
I'm really interested in this idea of, you said about it not being a character assassination, of course, but actually this thing about female labour and reclaiming the work of women within these sorts of great man narratives. And you mentioned right at the start, as part of that default industrial narrative, the sort of great work of these animators and filmmakers. Is that becoming an increasingly important element through episodes like this, The Owls of Athens, where you have these really intricate... I was staggered that the frames were essentially these embroidered pieces of work that were, and there are issues obviously around sound and the importance of voiceover and the use of atmospheric sounds, I felt, in this episode more than the others perhaps. But I was just wondered, is sort of reclaiming the work of women as part of this project something that's sort of emerged out of the multiple contributions of illustrators and embroiderers and people like that? Is that something that's kind of come out of your research?
Yeah, I mean, all the things that I've said today have been informed by the underpinning research. Ref klaxon again. But the point is, from day one, I had a sit down. I had this lovely chat, summer's day in the back garden. Peter Firmin, John Firmin, Dan Postgate, Charlotte Firmin, Emily Firmin. We were getting some of the models out. We had cream tea, and just that first moment, 3.5 years ago, there was so much more to say. There was so many more contributions by women to the production of small films. I talk in the book about Joan Firmin in terms of the kind of domestic labour of enabling the production to take place, even though there were 6 young children running around on this very small space. You know, how do you then do stop motion animation with 6 small children, not messing with continuity? She's responsible for knitting the clangers. She helps to produce some of the stuff on Sam on Boff's Island. But she's incredibly self-effacing. I've spoken to her a few times. I just did that. That's about as much as you get. So it's really working hard to kind of get her the recognition. And in terms of Bagpuss, there's this sense, you mentioned cottage industry before, and I think that's an appropriate term, but I also find it unsatisfactory because it almost feels like it underplays what's going on at kind of the Firmin space, which is kind of the hotbed of where it all takes place. Joan's going out in the evening, she's doing evening classes, she's learning embroidery, enamelling, she's going into local schools, she's teaching enamelling, so she's doing a lot more. And I get the sense that there probably were these conversations where maybe Oliver or Peter had said, We need something different for this sequence. Joan, kind of, what could you do us something? And then she's probably said, I could do you some enamels, or I could embroider something. And that's the way it would have been perceived at that kind of first point of creative decision making. But actually, the labour that's gone into then, a week later to kind of say, well, here's 11 embroidered owl sequences for you, is just lost. That's kind of compressed, and that's what I'm trying to unravel.
Yeah, and it's a great sequence, pun intended, to unravel. So yeah, absolutely. Just with our conscious of time, why don't we move on to our final episode, which I'm delighted for. You got completely right, Chris. That is the right answer. This is the best episode. But why don't you explain?
And it's
why?
appropriate that we only spend 1 minute talking about the mouse smell, because to be honest, it's on every single TV compilation you ever see. It's the example everyone ever talks about, quite rightly so, because it's brilliant, it's charming, it's funny, it's inventive. It's got all of the stuff on screen in terms of the workmanship of Peter Firmin, the craft to make that miniature mill that works in the way it does. I sat down, I was telling Chris, I made Charlie and Evie sit down and watch Bagpuss episodes with me this week as my prep for this. And that was the one. Charlie loved that episode, and there's a reason for it. It has all the elements that you need in terms of fantasy and surprise and craft.
Yeah. My notes on it are that it's an example of a very well pitched and plotted episode. Nice little twist at the end, of course. I do like a twist. I was actually doing a bit of research around both this episode and the response following Postgate's death, and particularly Charlie Brooker doing that sort of piece on Screenwipe about his work. And one of the things that he talked about was sound, and he said that you have these sedate sounds in a lot of these episodes, but crucially these are sounds that can then be repeated by children after the program. They're very easy to do, the sound of trains or the sound of the clangers and the sort of the gestures that the professor makes when he's like that. And I really thought that was striking. The soundtrack, tone, character, all of these things are pitch perfect. Then in this episode you have stories. I think that this time the story that's told is drawn illustrations, if I remember rightly. But it's just an example of an episode that in 12 minutes or so manages to set up sets up the intricacy of this mill, pose a narrative problem around the ability of this mill out of cardboard mill at that, out of chocolate biscuits, making chocolate biscuits out of breadcrumbs and butter beans, and then destabilizing it as part of a trick and so forth. And so that level of knowledge, I just think it's such a cleverly put together episode, and allows you for the first time to sort of go. And I think that's why it links quite nicely with flying, is that it takes us behind the curtain to borrow the second, or to do the second Wizard of Oz reference of the episode.
I think there's a difference there, because I think in the flying episode the mice engage in a deception, whereas I feel like in this one they have kind of they've swallowed the fantasy. Yeah. They've kind of bought into it too deeply, and they believe that they are actually creating chocolate biscuits from the butter beans and breadcrumbs. And it's a little bit gentler at the end, and I think that's kind of sweet to see.
Yeah, it's a different understanding of how objects work, isn't it? And then their jokes, obviously, on the professor, which is probably an appropriate place to end the discussion. Chris, thanks so much for helping us, for unpacking Bagpuss for us, and we're really excited to read your book. Listeners who are listening in the future, go and access it through all available independent bookshops and other bookshops that stock it. Is there any final thoughts you want to share, Chris, just as a wrap-up for our Anifest listeners? Thank you so much for listening throughout the day. If you've enjoyed our various episodes and things, and they'll be on, I believe, the archive. They'll be on the database for another while yet, so there's still time to unpack some of the stuff we provided. So is there any final thoughts we need to cover about Bagpuss, Chris?
No final thoughts about Bagpuss. You can buy the book and find out more in that. In terms of Anifest, I mean, if you've made it this far and you're a frequent attender at Anifest, then it's a shame we can't meet together in person this year, but we'll be back again next year. Thank you for your support, your ongoing support. We really value you as a festival audience. I hope you've really enjoyed this, and there's going to be more throughout the rest of this fantasy animation Canterbury Anifest mashup it's very exciting, and thank you for listening.
And we'll see you for the Q&A. So please do take part in that if you're listening to this before that started. Chris, that's been us for another week. You can find us, of course, at fantasy-animation.org. Access all manner of blogs and podcasts there, as well as on social media, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and Reddit at FanAnim Research, FANANIM Research. I'm going to go back to sleep now and turn into a black and white photograph, and I'll see you there.
What a harrowing thought, Alex. But because surely the outcome of that is that me and Chris become inanimate.
I'm hoping. Chris, you have to say bye now to end the episode.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
The bony king of nowhere, he sat upon his throne. He didn't much like sitting there because his throne was made of stone.
His throne was made of marble white, its feet were made